You go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome to our monthly talk series at Digra India, which is the India chapter of the Digital Games Research Association. Today with us, we have Dhruv Jani, who is the founder of an independent games and arts practice studio called Oleomingus. He works at the intersections of post-colonial writing and interactive fiction and explores the use of hypertext as a tool of alternate historiography. His practice is keenly interested in languages, translations, and questions of authorship, with a focus on histories occluded by colonial authority and violence. He's currently a resident of Anand University in Ahmedabad, a partner at the Improvising Futures grants at IICSI University of Guelph, and serves on the advisory committee at Games Artists International Network. Through an exploration of electronic literature, his games have critiqued how the stories of our various identities are remembered and exploited. Excuse me, especially across the procedurally mediated systems and databases of the modern day internet. His work also explores the possibility of using video game spaces as sites of protest and reparation against such neo-colonial erasure. He is the recipient of the Amaze New Talent Award, the recipient of an arts practice grant from the India Foundation of the Arts. He's been a resident at the India Art Fair and at Khoj Artists Association in Delhi, and his games and writings have been exhibited at VNA and Somerset House, London, Serendipity Arts Festival, Goa, Bartlett School of Architecture, Phoenix Gallery, Leicester, Jawahar Kala Kendra, Jaipur, Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, New York, and Kill Screen in Los Angeles, and VGA at Chicago, among other places. We're very, very glad to have Dhruv here. His games have been, well, a foundational part of Digra India's formation. Back when it was GSI Adda, one of the first formal discussions and talks we had was on the Games of Studio Oleomingus. And we're very, very happy that Dhruv has returned. And as for the format of today's talk, before I hand it over to Dhruv, Dhruv is going to be going over a few slides and locating the games of Oleomingus and the practices that he's attempting to instill for, say, 25-30 minutes, post which myself, Oritro, and Dhruv will have an open conversation for a little while in the Adda form that we like, and then the floor will be thrown open to questions. So thank you everyone for joining, and I will quit yapping and let Dhruv take the floor so we can begin.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be back at Digra India. In the span of time that we spoke ages ago, you guys have done wonderful work. So it's great to be speaking to you again. I'm just going to share my screen. Give me 1 second here. All right, great. Can you see my slide on screen? Brilliant. All right, so I'm just going to jump in. So we're calling it on the production of counterfeit realities at room temperature. I don't quite know what that means. We'll figure it out. Okay. So I want to look at video games as sites of post-colonial confrontations, but particularly suspended confrontations, these perpetual confrontations that we're very interested in going through. The talk is not so much about our work as it is about situating our work in the broader context that we want to practice in, and how we look at video game cultures and traditions right now. Wisława Szymborska, the Polish anti-war poet, in her text, a photograph from September 11, speaks of those who jumped from the burning towers and speaks of them thus. This is an excerpt from the poem, the first and the last stanzas. The photograph halted them in life and now keeps them above the earth towards the earth. I can do only two things for them: describe the flight, and not add a last line. In my own practice, at our studio, I've tried very hard to retain the dignity of those whose private griefs and alienations often form the contours of our games. And I've wondered why tell difficult stories in games at all. And to prefigure some of what we will spend the next half hour or so discussing, I have come to realize that it is the dignity of incompleteness, of there not being an authorial or historical inevitability, which draws me to the latent grace of this medium. I do not wish to be the photographer that captures each parabolic descent into history, merely the poet who absorbs the photographer's avarice for that iconic and cruel image. Hi, I'm Dhruv, as you know, well, we just spent a while discussing. I'm one half of an independent games and arts practice studio called Oleomingus, where we build narrative video games, study electronic literature, collaborate on archival reconstructions and theater projects, and conduct new media studies in various forums. Much of my work occurs at the intersection of post-colonial writing and interactive fiction, with both domains being used to study gradients of power and the way authority shapes the telling of histories. By locating our gaze at the point of a perpetual suspension, we offer the possibility of an infinite counter where no one history is codified, no single fate and doomed in time, no one method of record privileged over another. Let me step back for a minute here. Cultures rarely emerge fully formed, ready to tell the stories of their existence to those they seek to enthrall. They are assemblages, and as all assemblages, their capacity to remember and celebrate their own form is ever evolving. By remaining incomplete as computational systems, the world learns to tell stories about itself and construct itself in the image of the stories that it tells. Cultures constantly compute new forms of telling old tales and deepen their presence in time. And using our work, we have only now begun to wonder how do cultures that emerge around computational and simulational media tell the stories of our most private and foundational ruptures and schisms. To borrow somewhat shamelessly from one of my own games, to be complete is to be enclosed. To find yourself contained within the margins of your own body and the boundaries of collective reason. To be complete is to be able to see an edge to history. In using hypertext to probe these certain edges of history, I'm particularly interested in the susceptibility of sacrosanct ideas when players are allowed to question them with a degree of irreverence that rebuilds the weave of culture in such an entangled form that the planar fabric of some half-forgotten history cannot help but become manifold. Of using interactive fiction as a practice of becoming comfortable in not knowing, of accepting entangled, incomplete forms of knowledge as possible truth, and above all, not delineating into some finite taxonomy of human suffering the entire history of colonial or neo-colonial rule. We call the practice of producing such fictions concentric, believing that some stories from the fissures of identity, community, race, and gender will simply not be told until the violence of their recollection and the absurdity of their form is not somehow accommodated in the method of their telling. Because to be complicit in the creation of such multitudinal identities is the simplest way of ensuring that authority has a limited role to play in the record of our lives. Speaking of absurdity, you see, it's very difficult to play games with cynicism. They require a commitment to the absurdity of their form and a submission to the insularity of their rules, which makes them excellent sites of fabulation and provocation, perhaps even sites of interrogation and reparation and repair. It is this possibility that makes me want to seek confrontations with power within the insularity of game worlds. Rather than speak of individual projects, which I'm sure we'll have a chance to delve into when we converse, I'm using this talk to put our practice into perspective and to focus on an esoteric corner within the broader craft and culture of game making. I want to talk about interactive fiction in particular and argue how it has been a vital counterpoint against the all-encompassing push towards immersion and visual engagement in games media. Interactive fiction, to those unfamiliar, is merely a dislocation of text, such that it requires a slightly altered form of reading and criticism that takes into account not just a reader's agency, but also a reader's labor in the assembly of meaning. And I want to argue that the practice and tradition of electronic literature or hypertext or agodic writing has long preserved room for heterodox voices to participate in game cultures, and how our own modest work at the studio folds into this long legacy of an anti-extractivist form of game making. While video games and video game cultures undoubtedly contain the tendency to repeat and reaffirm colonial and capitalist hegemonies, I want to quickly demonstrate how game histories indicate a richer, variegated craft where interactive fiction has served as a powerful bulwark against their ahistoric and mendacious pleasures that games often sell us. The games I'm talking about are not some utopian ideal. I'm not talking about games in the future. Electronic literature has long shared a common purpose with avant-garde movements, such that they each in their own way have torn apart texts and cities and catalogs and maps and institutions of authority to try and resist the endless plasticity of capital's ever-encroaching presence. Some games, by the sheer novelty of manipulating text and models of authorship, do appear to be in continuous dialogue with works of Oulipo practitioners like Calvino or Dadaists, or by authors of interpolated fictions like Borges, or even the psychogeographical works of the Situationist International. But such assonance might simply be the result of a generous retrospective reading. Nonetheless, and despite its insularity, a wonderful variety of work has emerged over time when games are not beholden to the centrality of the player, an idea I'll circle back to in a bit. From strident political discourse to satire to illustrated books and cartographic experiments to intimate simulations, essays, neorealist fiction, classical fantasy theater, tomes of lore and fan fiction, postmodern writing, and much more besides. Take Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams and Steve Mretzky as an example, released all the way back via Infocom Games in 1984. For a game in a medium that has, well, quite literally just been born, it includes an unreliable narrator who does not simply lie to you, but actively withholds game systems from your character and then gloats about it. Or that sometimes your words might get sucked into wormholes with the inadvertent capacity to start a confusion of wars halfway around the galaxy. And at one point you can die and the game keeps on going, telling you to shut up and play dead since it has more important things to worry about. Or one might look at A Mind Forever Voyaging, released the very next year in 1985. It is a fascinating attempt at trying to mount a critique of Reagan-era politics in the aftermath of Reagan's overwhelming victory by narrating the consequences of those politics over a long and distant series of futures in the life of one man who is being sent through time to bear witness. Or 1998's Photopia, which has you traveling through stories even as the constancy of the worlds being constructed around you starts to shift, using a sequence of spectacular cinematic jump cuts made out of text. Or 1994's Patchwork Girl by Shelley Jackson, where the author is writing both as herself and as Mary Shelley, reconstructing in the patchwork self of Frankenstein's monster for the new world, a new Prometheus for a neo-romantic fable of dislocated identities. 1999's Isle by Sam Barlow, a legend of interactive fiction, has you playing in a grocery store aisle at the moment of a deep private crisis, and you are able to perform just a single action before the game will always end, leaving you with both a conclusion to your story and a piece of the puzzle that will tempt you back into the aisle that you now dread. All these, and we haven't even emerged from the limited cocoon of parser text fiction. 2000 gives us Emily Short's Galetta adapting the Greek myth of Pygmalion. The game ponders the ownership of women's bodies and turns a series of short conversations with a statue in a museum into sites of profound reckoning with ideas of possession, art, belief, and love. In 2012, Counterfeit Monkey, again by the same author, challenges all language, even that with which the game itself is made, endlessly delighting fans of the Tractatus by letting you edit reality with an alphabet remover to change its pictures and facilitate your escape from the Bureau of Orthography in a city quite literally called Anglophone Atlantis. 2013's Twine Spectacle, My Father's Long, Long Legs, perhaps a game you've played already, is a remarkable return to the earthy comforts of catacombs in the face of ruins of a Thatcherite Britain. It is the story of a patriarch who has lost his job and now starts to burrow his way into tunnels beneath his house, here told with a delightful hint of discomfort, body horror, and discordance. Or take 2014's 80 Days by Meghna Jayant and Inkle Studios as an example, a hilarious counter-colonial reworking of Verne's adventure tale. Or the spectacular Howling Dogs by Porpentine, a visceral, cathartic twine game that swings through a spectrum of desire and depression and care and isolation, agency and violence, a game likely to turn you mad if you chanced upon it during the pandemic, and yet as startling a feminist parable as ever programmed. If you find any of these intriguing, you will be happy to know that I've mentioned just a tiny sliver of work produced over the last 20, 25 years, completely ignoring dozens of forms and hundreds of authors. Now examine these works alongside a history of popular games that emerged between 1980 and 2000, and we'll limit our time frame there. And you will notice a peculiar leapfrogging of text games and, for the lack of a better word, conventional video games. Will Crowther's Colossal Cave, for example, is near contemporaneous with Pong, and a variant of Adventure is released the same year as Tetris is made. Zork Succeeds Space Invaders is released alongside Atari's Asteroids and precedes Pac-Man by just a year. Early text adventure games witnessed the zenith in the aftermath of the arcade game crash of 1983 across Japan and North America. And the last of the influential Infocom games are released in 1985-86 before it is acquired by Activision, which is also when you start to see Sega, Nintendo, and Atari consoles proliferate. Super Mario was released in 85, Zelda 86, Metal Gear in 87, Prince of Persia in 89, and by 1991-92, commercial text games have all but vanished, leaving behind their legacies in a variety of role-playing games like Ultima, narrative tools, and storytelling systems that are still central to the medium till date. I want to pause here for a second and draw attention to the distinction between the two dominant strands of games and game cultures that emerged from two different readings of the medium during this 20-year period. The first being that of text adventures, and the second born of games that were simulating a visual game world, starting with the labyrinths of arcade games like Pac-Man and the scrolling map worlds of games like Mario, or the cartographic landscapes in oblique view of Zelda or Metal Gear, to path tracing illusions of games like Wolf 3D that center a player to such an extent that the game world altogether disappears if you turn your gaze away from it. Note, I'm not making an argument about ludonarrative dissonance here, calling one gameplay and the other narrative. I'm simply distinguishing games that predominantly derive from the language of visual simulations and are centered around a player body or gaze, and games that are foregrounded by a literary framework and a vocabulary of actions that form a grammar of rules. One might bring many other such frames to bear upon a criticism of games, I'm sure, and they would all yield different histories and different insights. But I'm making a distinction here between two dominant forms of electronic games, both dominant at roughly the same time, to demonstrate how one centers the game world around a player's presence, making a simulated world seem inevitable from the point of view of the player, and how the other builds an understanding of the player around a grammar of their actions in a game world, making the player subject to the same logic that simulates the world itself. I believe this distinction is at the heart of trying to understand why one half of the medium has proven itself more resilient to imperial doctrine than another. As I drag in this second category of games played on maps or scrolling landscapes, games that foreground a visual simulation, as I drag them into conversation, I feel compelled to point out the obvious, that our understanding of these heterotopias is characterized by a language infected with the parlance of European settler colonialism and the intellect of early venture capitalists who believed their grand expeditions of conquest and loot were somehow moral victories. Made abundantly apparent by the last decade or two of game industry's influence is the fact that games are willing tools for narratives that seek to normalize oppression and calcify inequities. Moreover, games, not the medium, but cultures around it, are very bad at recognizing that not all who were oppressed under colonialism were oppressed in the same manner or to the same degree, nor did the inequities of colonial rule disappear with the end of the British Raj in India, or with the end of the Protectorate in Morocco in 56, or with the subsumption of rule and due in Daman in 61, or even in 1975, the same year Crowther begins his work on Advent, the first adventure game, with the overthrow of Portuguese rule in Mozambique. Most games have stridently refused to acknowledge the deeply rooted racial, economic, communal, and gendered fault lines, some pre-colonial, others created or worsened by colonial rule, that continue to define the contours of modern authority and ruling structures, where the right to author individual histories is deeply contested, and the modern global mandate is presented as somehow being inevitable. But instead of discourse, the dominant game production houses give us thinly veiled operant conditioning chambers and loot box infested gambling engines. We get games being shoehorned into every surveilled crevice of our lives until what ought to be rule-bound proscenium is inevitably breached, and game-like behaviors in large data systems start to upend labor, possession, and even bodily sanctity, and start to unleash havoc upon ordinary lives. A process widely known as gamification. We know games that confuse the threshold between simulated space and reality, leaving no room to step back from the interaction, and by extension, excusing all manner of depravity as a natural continuum of the game, or games that promise a complete retreat from the world and celebrate the privilege of an alienation even at catastrophic cost. Games that sell pleasure, built upon simple fantasies designed to extract endless attention or engagement, leaving all those involved in its continuous grasp spent and exhausted. Games that weaponize nostalgia to bandage over scars of having to confront a mass withdrawal of the populace from the fate of their own material communities. And even games that encourage conquest and the taming of the heterodox, that normalize the flattening of all interaction with an entangled world, so that our virtual spaces that are already sparse start to challenge the individual dignity of all the myriad creatures and ecosystems that compose the world around us. Many of these mendacious tendencies do not emerge from games as a medium. We have already seen some counterexamples, but games are no longer medium bound, and their systems have spilled out into the world at large, leaking into popular culture, political mobilization, and sometimes even real world violence. And I'm happy to provide actual examples if need be that I've elided here in the interest of both time and my own sanity. But games have unleashed a particular series of societal harms that games in the medium's current form are completely incapable of helping dismantle. While practicing at such sites of erasure, I want to ask, do virtual spaces help clarify the world around us, or do they occlude it in various ways? What does it take to bend a medium of collective escape and privilege towards the material needs of actual people? How do we map our griefs across server farms if we cannot see them, and political borders? What marks the edge of our simulated landscapes? How deep do we ink our electronic borders? What cataclysms do we etch into the memory of modern myth? The broader hope being that by asking such questions of the medium, we might create bulwarks against the ahistoric and mendacious pleasures of games, that such questions might help build caution into game-making practices that can eventually excoriate Orientalist fallacies and white savior narratives or clash of culture narratives, and start to draw severe attention to the needs of labor and bodies and gender, memory, identity, community, erasure, and anxiety. Let me end here by returning to a kind of beginning, to a start, if you will, by traveling some 200 years ago and finding ourselves at the mouth of the largest cave network on the planet, the Mammoth Caves in Kentucky. Here, perched upon the lip of the Stygian abyss, we find a handsome young cave guide and explorer by the name of Stephen Bishop, a self-taught geologist who tried to chart the Mammoth Cave network in an attempt to buy his freedom from enslavement by exchanging detailed maps of the cave for his liberty. Over the course of 2 decades, Stephen single-handedly mapped the countless passages, subterranean rivers, and lakes of the network, charting and naming a staggering 226 avenues, 47 domes, 23 pits, 8 waterfalls. And under the terms of his owner's will, Stephen was freed in 1856. He died a year later before he could free his wife and son from bondage. Long after his death in 1842 or so, a map drafted entirely from memory by Stephen was still in use. Returning to the caves about 100 years later, in 1972, we meet a physicist, Patricia Crowther, an avid explorer who finds a hidden passage marked on Stephen's original map that reveals that the caves are an interconnected 600-odd kilometer long network. One of Pat's caving companions was her husband, Will Crowther, who used computer plotters to draw the group's maps. A few years later, when he separated from his wife, he wrote a program to revisit and recreate their wandering through these records that he had meticulously documented in the form of some kind of a searchable database. The program was called Advent, short for Adventure, a text query system that let you amble around Will's recollection of the cave system that he had once explored with his wife, building in the process one of the earliest and certainly one of the most influential text adventure games ever created. By late 1970s, Crowther's electronic map of Stephen's Caves, alongside a smattering of Tolkienian fiction, had spawned a variety of fictions on the ARPANET, and you would be hard-pressed to find a contemporary video game that does not owe a portion of its existence and structure to this chthonic creation. Such are the delightfully entangled origins of the medium. Histories of people burrowing into systems in an attempt to bend this world into the contours of a new order. A quixotic tale, perhaps, but a much richer tale, I believe, of where games come from than one of teleological and technological progress that we are often asked to venerate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dhruv. That was, well, let's just say I feel enlightened in the best possible way. It's a special experience to, to listen to someone with the depth of knowledge that you have and feel this sense of enlightenment. So I think we can start dragging things out in different directions now, Dhruv. If that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Aritra,
Yeah,
would you like to start
definitely.
with anything?
Yeah. So, firstly, again, it was a wonderful talk, and especially the two aspects, the two slides I really loved is the wonderful and a lot of it. It felt very validating to see the list of games, and it's to see I have played a lot of them, not just barely knowing them, but also like I have actually interacted with them, and the very, very important portion that needed to be highlighted, constantly needs to be highlighted, is this whole conception of games as player as the center,
Yeah.
player as the heart of the whole design and everything. That is, yeah, that needs to be constantly reevaluated, is how much we should prefigure that and how much should our uh, focus be with in terms of design. And that was really an interesting talk. And before I begin, Ishan has like start the emceeing of this whole talk portion.
I mean, no, you go ahead, Aritra. You go ahead. We
No,
can
no.
we can speak on it.
First I wanted to make these points. Now I'm
Yeah.
giving it to you.
So, I mean, I was also just thinking that, again, before the talk started, we were talking about methods of production and methods of marketing, right? Distribution.
Yeah.
So, do you think that that has impacted how games are made and what games are made, so to speak?
So games are definitely, and video games in particular, right? It's really sort of zoomed in on video games. Have for the longest time, at least from, I would say, early 1990s, been mediums of this intense capital concentration.
Yeah.
So that their distribution until a short phase of democratization between 2008, 2014, with like the Twine games and indie games and so on, has not really been fractured. Even now, we are undergoing a process of massive consolidation in games industry, right? This is
Absolutely.
of swallowing everything up, Tencent swallowing everything up. So definitely the kinds of games that get produced are very much informed by game making practices, traditions, and cultures that have been seeded 5 years ago. Games that you're looking at today are the result of production systems that have been in momentum for such a long time now, and productions that are there, because so much of resource and capital and interest is concentrated itself around this idea of games that they think is meaningful to tell. And a very small, very opaque set of people have any conception of what that idea is, what a valuable game or what a coherent game narrative is going to be across a 5-year, 7-year span of production. So most of the games that we merely accept as the as markers of culture when they are released are actually speculative markers of culture 5 years ago in the heads of a handful of people who then worked very hard to convince us this is exactly the game we wanted when it was released.
And it's also become a lot of the a lot of the perception about games is also dominated by factors that, as you said, are intrinsically linked with capital. Like the moment an indie game gets a big publisher, you'll have a host of people saying that's not an indie game anymore. The moment
Exactly.
there's 10 people working on a game instead of one, there's going to be 100 people saying that's not an indie game, that's this, that's that. Because I just feel like in terms of how we produce these, this the fact that a lot of people, especially in India, try to deny that games have any cultural significance, especially video games, or any cultural impact. But even here, if you look at the efforts that are being made and the perspectives that people have,
Mhm.
especially with regard to game production, where you know there it is quite obvious that games have a cultural impact and status as a cultural artifact, not just after they're produced, but during their production, because of the means of production and the way, the number of people, it all comes back at some point to inform the cultural status of that game and games in general.
Exactly, and because these sort of larger endeavors of game making practices remain opaque until the game is actually released,
Yes.
or there's a drip feed of how the developers want you to perceive the game and the culture around.
Which is also the devlog culture that's really developed on YouTube over the last two
Exactly.
years, I'd say year and a half.
Yeah.
It's crazy because that in and of itself has become a way of marketing your game, a way of establishing your game as a cultural phenomenon in some form. Like, even if a game's viral for 3 days because of a cool devlog,
Yeah.
those 3 days they can do a lot of things for the development. They can
Exactly. And
set the
affect their
developer up.
usual livelihoods.
They can get a Kickstarter completed. You can do a lot with 3 days of going viral on the internet.
True. So this, bizarre accumulation of people's, attention spans and virality in games and then their perceptions of what is inherently valuable as a spectacle or as a novelty that allows these games to remain, popular at all, harms any capacity to produce long-term cultural conversations around what it is that the games are inherently about, what they might be simulating, how those simulations proliferate from game to game, and not necessarily in the instance of a single game being produced. So that game communities get entirely isolated or restricted to either fandoms or participants in the in the celebration of that game. It's a sort of very overt public playing of that game through
Which
streams.
is a lot. It's happened a lot with Undertale, and especially with Deltarune having just come out. Like, you see how many people are it. The fandom is not as concerned with playing the game as I thought it would be. I have never been involved in it because I've unfortunately not yet played the games, but it's just the discourse that is generated seems to almost entirely be generated by people's perceptions rather than people who've sat and played the thing.
Yeah.
In this case,
Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
in this case, I was also thinking of a specific word that uh, I'm obviously keeping it grounded from the perspective of the Indian game development scene, and that is going on, not just game development, but also the audience perspective. But mostly currently, I'm speaking from there, is the idea of this fidelity, the question of fidelity, and the conception of fidelity that is within the uh, which completely predominates in terms of that there is a very prescriptive nature of what this fidelity needs to be, to sort of capture what is a video game, what is a digital video game. And as I was already speaking before we started the recording, is this, since this is already handicapping us from experimenting uh, more freely and widely with multiple different media formats that have come together. Because that is what is one of the plus points of this digital medium,
Yeah.
where why would you wish we already have a lot of scans and all these websites available for scanning PBR textures and all these things, but for people who don't for people at home who are not from this technical jargon. The technical jargon is PBR, essentially what we in usual lingo call high definition realistic photorealistic graphics. That is essentially PBR. But what Ishan was also mentioning, that recently there are games that are coming up which are focused on claymation.
Yeah.
And we also talked about both your games, the games that you have, Studio Lumingus have made, have this kind of an effort on effect of connecting back to the materials, the materiality of uh, things, the Museum of Dubious Splendors, and all these things. That there is this kind of constant conversation back to the daily life, and not just daily life, but also the media, the physical media that we have, and even found in the work of Afra Shafiq, who's
Yeah.
we have been talking about, who's also making work which are again in conversation with these mixed media formats. Ha- if we are to go by the current uh, idea and fixation with fidelity, where we would not have the space to place these games. So that's
I
another
mean,
thing.
yeah. So not to give the broad argument around fidelity and unnecessary grandiosity, but it does help to look at it in a historical sort of context. So if you look at Holbein's paintings and oil paintings from around the time when colonial possessions are being painted in object form, there's a great deal of fascination with the laws of perspective and the conditions of realism that are emulated in picture form, right? The great deal of fascination with the softness of brushstrokes and with how light will be simulated, and a lot of language around that and conversation around that. The insularity of technical jargon around that will sound like photogrammetry works and physically based, shaders and materials, and in Unity and stuff like that. And on the other hand, you have around the same time, perhaps a little bit later, you have sort of miniature paintings, or say to pick up particular artists, say the works of Nansuk, which play out like mischievous comic book panels, playing with scale and and the capacity to view domesticity in this, very very elegant composition of brushstrokes and characters, leaving sketches incomplete, and then returning to them later across an atelier of different artists working on pictures iteratively. So all these other traditions that are much closer to how we read forms of reality rather than always simulate them, and certainly not enamored by any exactitude in the visual material simulation of in the visual simulation of materials, but rather in how we deal with tools and processes and culture and confusions, and embed them into a grammar that can be read, sometimes as a comic book, sometimes as a folio of paintings, sometimes with poetry alongside it. And you see that schisms emerge in this novel fascination that video games have from
Yeah.
1991 onwards, where they
Mhm.
make one player the center of a game world, right? As I very briefly mentioned, you have path tracing that makes game worlds disappear if you don't look at them, so that your
Absolutely, yeah.
ocular experience of the game world becomes so central to its existence that you cannot help but invest all your effort and energies in simulating it in completion, whatever that completion is, which is always forever deferred, because obviously, simulation is reality and exactitude. If it were, it would be useless. In a very Bohesian sense, I suppose. And then on the fringes of that, of that process, where not so much time and effort and capital is spent on granular fractal-based simulation of smoke particles and Brownian motion or cloth physics and stuff like that, you have people who start to wonder, what about reality are we simulating in the first place or speculating upon, and drawing sort of these broad distinctions between normative and speculative simulations, and the utility of these models as they are being built out. And that allows them much closer access to the behavior of materials and our relationships to them. So when a claymation sort of game becomes an interface, becomes text, what happens to text made out of clay becomes this very pertinent question that the game is forced to grapple with. Which would just be idiotic for a game like Call of Duty, which is so enamored by grass physics to try and answer it. Clay for it is just the textural substrate from which to grow grass, not to grow text out of it.
Speaking of fidelity, I was just thinking, that there's also been an obsession for cultural fidelity, especially now that we're talking about games that have come out of India. We were talking about the idea of these larger initiatives. It's kind of interesting when you look at something like, say, I don't know, Raji and Asura's Wrath, and then you look at something like Black Myth Wukong. And and it also is sort of worth considering, I guess, worth discussing how cultural fidelity, social fidelity is also something that seems to be so demanded by every player base ever, regardless of where they're from or whether they actually belong to that culture or not, that it just doesn't seem to exist anymore. Which is why Black Myth Wukong, was such a, for every AAA thing about it. What was surprising was that it maintained this kind of cultural fidelity, which is something that so many supposedly aspire to, but it never really keeps the people who play the games happy.
True. Cultural fidelity is a very, at least to me, and to our ways of looking at our own work, is a very poisonous idea. Partly because it sort of succumbs to a very, very specific kind of jingoism very easily. But also the idea of fidelity means that you're talking about culture as some sort of a telos, right? Something that you can benchmark your fidelity to. Even if it is only culture now, and you expect it to change over time, you still freeze frame culture for all the players you expect to play your game, and then benchmark your game's ability to narrate your shared culture across that range. And then there's also the temptation that games like Black Myth succumb to of exotification, right? Where they orientalize their reading of their own culture, so that they seem to approach their own culture with the absurd wonder of a European newcomer to their show. It's like, oh wow, monkey
Absolutely.
sort of it's stick in this manner. Let's spend a lot of time and energy getting that exactly right. Not that none of those conversations are important to have within context and within, if there was room for other kinds of conversations as well alongside games like these, it'd be brilliant. These games could then be in conversation with games that seem to push back against this one culture for a sixth of the world's population, right? It cannot be a cultural game for such a large number of people. It simply cannot capture the varieties and complexities and nuances of belief and faith and mythology and history as it is passed down through lived culture. And games being simulations, more than anything else, it reinforces the idea that our speculated realities are now founded on prior speculations of mythologies, that our mythologies were this living and this breathing and this realistic, and we are simply recreating them now as a justification for a past that may or may not have existed, an antecedent that we are now creating in such convincing form that it can very quickly become a slippery and poisonous method of imagined pasts.
No, which is why. Sorry, Aritra, go ahead. Go ahead. Aritra, you're not audible.
So basically, what am I audible, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that comes to mind with this terms of, because again, we are what we are all talking about is how there is a sort of singular view of what games are, what play is, uh, w- how video games should be, or like what is. It's a very prescriptive kind of documentation. And of this, one of the major aspects, even not from the player's side, it also originates from the side, as you mentioned, about the games being simulation, but simulation in a very specific way of that there needs to be a complete whole loop.
Yeah.
That the loop needs to be connected to each other. That the whole conception of a game loop. So I'm bringing up example from Indifferent Wonder, the Edible Place, the game that you have made. There I can see from perspective of this very game loop oriented person is how eating individual building blocks can would just leaving it there feels from this perspective uncanny
Yeah.
and uncomfortable. And because that's essentially, because if you as you guys made it, that if you eat any other numbered blocks, it doesn't cause a game over. It's
Yeah.
just a pause, and it's a reflective moment, and then you have to eat the same thing, but it does not lead into accumulation of anything that can reinforce a sort of a continual feedback loop. There is this gap, that the negative space is there, and it's a very gestalt way of kind of using mechanics to implement that kind of drawing thing. I would like to know from you more about how do you envision when do you stop, as in,
Yeah.
because that's essentially a question of in terms of the game loop that you're thinking. Where does the loop stop?
So if we, and to sort of give a very broad answer to your question, if we step back a little bit and think about simulations a little bit more, you get this expectation with simulations because of how they have traditionally been used, data simulations and simulational models of the universe as a kind of truth-seeking device, or as a kind of normative device, building an understanding of what is considered acceptable culturally,
Yeah.
socially, and so on. So you go through ritualistic practices that simulate something, or data models that simulate something, and come to a closer association with reality, which is what makes games which are speculative simulations or sometimes predictive simulations and so on very confusing, because they clothe themselves in the garb of these other kinds of truth-making processes, and more often than not do not insulate themselves from reality adequately. So with our games in particular, I like to impose a ritualistic beginning to the game and a ritualistic end to the game, even if the game becomes Ouroboros in that sense, an opening up of the game board and a closing up and all the chessmen back in their boxes, kind of a close to it. Not necessarily ending narratives in the process, but forcing the game to a kind of structural end so that the simulation does as little as it can to leak out of the game world. It can connect metaphorically or structurally or narratively to other conditions and other narratives, but that is in retrospect, when you understand what it is that you just played through, not so much in the act of playing the game continuously or over periods of time that the game would not allow you to play. And then drawing this distinction between what kind of a simulation your game is and why it makes this claim to a particular kind of truth is, I think, very crucial. So if you pivot your game on the idea that it is not just a realistic simulation of the world around you, but espouses through that realism a fundamental truth about the world, I think your game is very problematic, because you are making claims to fundamental truths about the world that your game is rarely designed to genuinely defend. I'm sure there are games, that slip between the cracks there, but maintaining games as these spaces of fabulation by these ritualistic, naughty encounters that tie you very well within the absurdity of the game world and limit it there, is, at least for our games, that has been very, very important, which is also partly the reason why they are short, and partly because we run out of patience to keep building them. But that brevity often helps in exiting the player at the right point in the game. This is enough. Shut the game down now, and leave.
It's actually a
Yeah.
very counter-cultural thing, uh, especially current zeitgeist is
Yeah,
infinite
because
games, like
because exactly
games.
everything's live service. Everyone wants you to
Yeah,
play forever,
games as
Yeah,
service has
which
is
is
is a,
something more that I was thinking of, just because we spoke about an attempt for cultural situation, something like Venbas. Venba becomes very interesting to me because it's an attempt at what I would consider a smaller scale cultural situation
yeah,
through something that's very material. Something that's very food is very tactile. You can touch it, you can smell it, you can taste it. But once again, inside the simulation. So,
yeah,
that kind of material situation, it becomes another, I don't know. It just feels to me like it is a uniquely different way of an
yeah,
attempt to situate a smaller part of this one-sixth of the population. It's not like, the thing with Venba is it can never claim to speak for more than what it claims.
yeah,
There's a
exactly.
very overt claim there that this is what we speak of. This is
Yeah,
what we speak for. So, you know,
yeah. I mean, Venba is one of my favorite sort of contemporary examples of this kind of ritual done right, right? It sort of turns
mm,
food making into a ritual. It has you participate in it, and a ritual that is particularly visceral because, well, food is involved, and and it's done really, really well. Sort of tying all these narratives of exclusion into something that you consume, and something that you're expected to, yeah, consume virtually, and then imagine consuming as you're playing through the game, and something that you can even carry beyond the game. So the things that you carry beyond the game, the recipes of the game, that you carry back into the real world, are not conditions that the game is speculating about. They are just artifacts that the game is building itself out of. So those are the rituals that the game anchors itself to, and that is what it expects you to carry back once you're done playing the game. And that, I think, is remarkably clever. Instead of asking you to carry back artifacts of exotic motifs, that the game introduced you to, it expects you to carry back an understanding of not just the cuisine that you may or may not consume, may or may not cook, but the intense labor and the histories of exclusion that cuisine associates itself with when you find it halfway across the world and not in its point of birth. That is exactly the sort of schism of simulations I was talking about, right? This game that is deeply interested in not just limiting itself to these very specific routines of domesticity. And I think domesticity as an idea is something that games are terrible at, usually.
yeah, yeah.
Gets it perfectly right, right? Sort of rather than have domestic spaces in games, you have inventories, where bodily care is instrumentalized. But
No,
when
which is why, uh, what was the name? Which is why unpacking is a one in a million game. It's not something that has been replicated, and God knows people have tried. People have tried a
yeah,
lot.
exactly. So
and
taking some of those very private bodily rituals where the logic of care and community is not centered around how the world is visualized and how we simulate it, but rather how we associate with it, and turning that into a game mechanic or a series of game mechanics, or game logics, I think is a very clever way of going about it.
in fact, that you brought up Venba, one of the things that Venba really got hold of, and that is currently also being, uh, even though the media keeps on harping about live service and all these things, uh, I see that games, there are genres. I don't like the term genre because I'm a very avid critic of genre, but for lack of a better word, genre, the fixation with genre is about few specific genres of like live service or multiplayer games or all these kinds of things. But a sort of revolution going on is with games that are casual, but not in the Nintendo way of casual, but casual in a very what the internet has coined girly games, sort of thing. That cooking games, dress up games, or puzzle and literally jigsaw puzzle, art puzzle kind of games, and alongside the sort of seed that was planted by games like Co-op or Bennett 40's other games that is
Yeah.
currently again having a resurgence in terms of climbing, difficult climbing games and all these things. Uh, and my and I want to bring this to your recent game the
Yeah.
hand you dealt with, where I've seen this. This has been long been building and with all your previous games, but here I'm seeing where you have entered and you have also prefaced in the hand you're dealt with that collection of digital toys, and I
Yeah.
really like that phrasing because again, toys also have their own connotations
Yeah.
themselves, and collection of digital toys and these toys that the game that you have made is essentially archive itself and making a sort of an archive, but it speaks the non-verbal and the physical language of casual games.
Yeah.
It has that kind of a casual game aspects and I want you to speak more on how the studio came across this whole
So,
genesis of this
so
game.
very interesting. And actually, it's a nexus that is still in flux, even at the studio. It's something we're working on. So, Hand Your Dealt, the version that is, I think, online still, is very old. I mean, it's like a year, maybe 2 years old. And each October, we are iterating on it. So, each October, we sort of build a different version and we sort of get a little bit better at dealing with the idea of an archive. We are also working on other archive-oriented projects. So there's a project that we're working on in collaboration with a wonderful landscape architect and designer, Riyasha, to look at a history of work surrounding a patch of forest in the Western Ghats, rewriting work there, sociological projects, anthropological and artistic projects there, and a compilation of work being done there. And in both cases, with the archives of the School for Improvisational Studies at Guelph and with this archive from the forest, and a few other projects besides that are very similar. There are a few functional requirements to how you deal with archives, right? So, for example, we quite like the idea of Wikipedia existing as it does, but also also a fascination with the wiki races that you can conduct on it. Like you go from one page on Wikipedia to the other in as few clicks as possible to unrelated pages. And these other weird games that you can play, often competitively and often online, using an archive as it otherwise exists or a repository as it otherwise exists. So we've been trying to use what are these very functional requirements of an archive that be indexed and searchable and a query system be built into it, with these cautions, that it need not open itself up to data harvesting and data scrapping tools altogether, and to try and bridge these requirements and these foundational concerns that archives have going from analog to digital right now, to bridge these two using games or toys rather, where these very intricate system driven but relatively simple, at least for humans, objects that you can now interact with, these digital interfaces or systems or game-like simulations that you can now interact with, gives you just a just this bizarre access to meaning-making processes as they otherwise exist in the archive than you would otherwise have gotten out of a conventional, SQL database or a conventional index, with a tag system associated with it, and so on. With the hope that there are these irreverent combinations and conversations that researchers can end up discovering on the archive, but only if they put in the effort to engage with it on its own terms. And that effort starts to escalate the longer you spend on the archive. It becomes more intricate, it becomes more demanding. It starts to shift its register of languages. It forces archives to become less readable than they would otherwise be if they were just opened up to computational processes without regard for who or what might be playing them. That is where we think we have found a utility for games that lie somewhere between video games and fidget spinners, games that you play mindlessly enough to engage with systems, but built on systems that are genuinely complex and genuinely intricate. So what is that logic of intricacy, and how at some point can we reveal that logic as the foundational reason why you are engaging with the archive in the first place, and map it on the archival logic of how we correlate projects or ideas or forms of activism inside. So that, I know it's a very broad project, and it's likely to continue for the next 4 to 5 years as we build out more of these web-based, accessible toys. And accessibility is very much both a constraint and an interesting space that sort of corrals the project away from desktop computers and the legacy of game language into web-based media, which is very flashy, full of these animated interludes, and the tools change every other day, and all these JavaScript clone libraries keep emerging and intervening in them. So it's a delightful and very weird space to try and explore.
Yeah, definitely. The web-based games are coming and making a sort of a quiet comeback nowadays also.
They are.
Ishan, take over.
Yeah, no. I was just going to say that I think this is a nice note to open up the Q&A on.
Mhm.
So there was one question before we started the meeting. I see one more in the chat, and there was one question before.
You can unmute and
You can,
speak.
we'd love it if you could unmute and speak.
Ali, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yeah.
If you want, you can unmute and ask the question directly. Or we can read it out. Type in the chat.
Yeah.
Next. So
you know what? Let's just go with the next question for now. I see one hand raised. Actually, you know what? No, let's go with
let's go by the next question is from Akanksha Swami. Okay, Ari is speaking.
Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to know, what is your opinion on asset flipping games? Does it democratize game development as a process, or does it pave the way for more slop games to be, development of more slop games?
Yeah. So I really like slot games. It's great that they exist. Great that games exist for like 3 weeks and then disappear from public cultural memory. If you look back at the history of game making, they are all asset flips, all of them. Like, Arcane Studios was born out of asset flips, and so was Looking Glass. So was the logic of, Bioshock. And Ken Levine's previous work with the sort of translating in clever ways, because asset flips were always sort of done under the cloak of sharing engines, sharing assets, and sharing personnel across these very opaque studios, which would then just release very different looking games. You never had a great deal of anxiety around the practice until now. And now that asset selling and capitalization itself has become somewhat problematic in how assets are stolen, especially open source and FOSS assets being stolen and then repurposed into commercial assets. And then the proliferation of AI tools building out assets by stealing other people's libraries and libraries of works. There are definitely ethical sort of pitfalls associated with the process here, but none of those ethical pitfalls, I think, land in the domain of game developers or asset builders rather in the marketplaces that profit from asset flips, right? So Unreal marketplaces like Fab or Unity asset stores are a cesspool of terribly authored and terribly mediated assets meant to coax games in this one particular direction. They are not the Quake modding community of let's share maps and see what weird kinds of things emerge out of them. There's a very direct commercial intent associated with asset flip and asset flip games. Assets are increasingly expensive to buy, and therefore asset flip games have to be spectacular and bizarre and provocative enough to make their money back, and that noxious cycle begins. But I don't think the fault lies in the practice, which is what games are built on. Using game rules and systems and engines and assets that nobody has the time to rebuild the wheel for each time you want to make a game again. It is also how people learn how to make games. You could not have game designers without game modding being this huge part of very large and very popular games like Skyrim and now Baldur's Gate 3. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a whole generation of game developers who learn the ropes of game making by playing and engaging with their own game worlds that they build out of assets that these game worlds and game systems already provide. But yeah, I'm not really in a grand moral panic about about asset flip games being prevalent or them being rug pulls of some kind. If people really want to invest their money in bizarre Kickstarter projects, I guess it's broadly the problem of platforms like Kickstarter not really moderating their the sort of projects that go inside of profiting from people, regardless of what kinds of projects are sold and disseminated through their sites. So none of these spaces have been good curators of game making practices or game cultures. None of the asset stores, outside of some specific Reddit communities and some YouTube communities and weird cultural pockets like that, which have had to fight against the systems that they are built on. I don't see very many healthy, very large, game communities that do not automatically push you towards, the next best games idea or something.
Yes, I understand. I think also we can take the next question.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So, next question is from Akansha Goswami. She has written, when you make your games, how do you decide which stories from Indian history to include? And what challenges do you face when trying to represent difficult topics like trauma and memory in an interactive format or way?
Yeah, so we do something a little bit covertly in that we don't really work across Indian history so much as we work across the history of Dharampur, the region that I broadly practice within and claim to be able to understand at least to a modicum. So we limit our practice to, I would say, to South Gujarat, North Maharashtra, parts of Madhya Pradesh, and the very specific histories of that region over the last 150 odd years, right? So coastal towns and villages, these farmland towns that were created by Parsi occupation and upper class occupation of tribal lands, and then lands that are still tribal lands, where the Bhil populace lives and has been instrumental in a series of land right movements and anti-colonial practices, both pre-independence and post-independence. So concentrating on that area, both geographical and cultural, gives us ready access to sort of boundaries to what kinds of stories we can tell. But then, because this area is also in the middle of an extractivist takeover by a draconian polity, and 20 years of the same government ruling Gujarat and exploiting the tribal belt in vicious ways, it gives us these very specific event-oriented sites of protest. Not that all our games are built as forms of protest, but it gives us these narratives that immediately emerge from people claiming rights to lands, languages, ways of living, culture, food, that is widely denied to them. So that is where we locate our practice. It makes it easier to condense our stories, the focus of our stories, down to specific events. But then how we deal with trauma and memory is a much harder question to answer, partly because we reinterrogate this question with every game. Usually there is always a lens of absurdity, which is the first inviting lens for players. The premise is absurd enough. You eat buildings, you mine telephones, you rotate clocks that were once made out of human bones that all herald the hour of partition, something like that. Where the dislocation from reality gives us, as authors, a little bit of room so that we don't inadvertently appropriate cultures that are even now engaged in forms of resistance and immediately translate their stories of resistance on the
This is
ground.
again, that question of fidelity that you were speaking about,
Exactly.
the commitment, or rather the lack of it in this case, to reality as we know it, quote unquote, is
True.
is often the source of the license, right? That's your
Yeah.
poetic license.
Yeah, exactly. And that room that the absurdity creates is then very meticulously hammered into the rigor of the gameplay. So if this is the consequence of mining telephones, you think through it rigorously enough. At least for us, that is important. What happens when you have Bakelite bits and synth, and what happens at the moment of its annexation. And the famous dialogue, "I've sinned." But so you think through these variegations in history from the disjunction that you created, so that you can always walk the consequences back if you need to during the telling of the story. But that tends to be the formal process. It is intuitively very, very esoteric, which is why the games are also esoteric.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dhruv. We'll take the next question. I think Shoharto's had his hand up for a while. So if you could, can you please unmute and ask your question to Dhruv?
Hey, I hope I'm audible, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Great discussion, and from the other two as well, or Itra and Ishan. So I don't know how much of a question this is, but this is a particular matter that I want to discuss with you, because I've seen, Studio Livingers has been a kind of a rare example who do not, does not pose games as a kind of didactic tool. Now, I'll explain what I mean. Let's say, for example, uh, Elizabeth Laponce's games, or the Pixel Hunt, or G4C, the whole G4C collective. Some of the games kind of offer what I felt, and this is a matter that I've recently been bugging me a lot, kind of empathy tourism, and is kind of reciprocates this idea of identity tourism by Lisa Nakamura, of course, but empathy tourism. So either like Venba, someone was discussing Venba as well, which is kind of a cooking game, gives us a kind of a refugee example, right?
Yeah.
Refugee life. So anyway, refugee or migration life, whatever. But games has become like simulate an experience, or raise awareness, or like teach empathy. So essentially, and Studio Livingers, particularly Edible Plays, what does it do? I feel like it gets the message very quietly across. The message kind of subliminally kind of embedded into the procedurality of the game, right? It does not, it creates an abstract domain of playing field, the gamescape, for example. So most of such indigenous games, or independent games, or these kind of games kind of, hijack the message, I believe. So they risk reproducing or producing this empathy tourism that allow the players to feel another suffering briefly without really shifting the power structure. So how do you tackle that particular issue, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a brilliantly framed question. You're right about empathy tourism, and I've always resisted critiquing games that indulge in the practice, especially if those are games that emerge from smaller developers and smaller teams, because we borderline succumb to that temptation at times. I can understand where that impulse is coming from. Games are these brilliant mediums of embodiment, so why not put you in the shoes of the oppressed, as it were? And you're absolutely right. Our worry is that it simply reinforces the power structures that normalize such oppression, and then give you through the games tools to surrender to such oppression or endure it. It doesn't result in meaningful conversations about the structures of power. Simply the phenomenological experience of being at the end of the power hierarchy or totem pole. There is a slight shift to that model that we try and practice, not always successfully. With Edible Places, it just worked remarkably well, which is to offer complicity against empathy, right? So not to try and drive the player into a position of empathy where they have, because they are embodying the other character, a great deal of empathy for their suffering, but rather to make the player complicit in the situation that they find themselves in. And often that situation is inherently bureaucratic. It is very close to the actions of power without giving the player any authority over their own fate. So you are not playing the brother who has been buried, whose tombstone gets eaten, who was probably a victim of the first wave of violence, and the most obvious node of resistance, if you were to empathize with resistance against state violence, but rather with the brother who was forced to conform to some degree to the governmental overreach that now forces him to eat buildings and leaves him with no choice but to do so, but still recognize that there is space for mourning and yearning for the loss that such a consumptive practice entails, so that you inadvertently become the oppressors of your own person in some degree. Again, something that happens with Pause Between the Ringing, you quite literally loop back into both the murderer and the ghost who haunts because of the murder. So the player becomes two sides of the same argument to some degree, right? They become complicit in the actions of power, and they become subject to the actions of power as well within the frame of the game. It's not always easy to pull off, and it's not something that we have any template for doing. But whenever that is achievable, I think it demonstrates a very curious and interesting way of examining power that mere empathy does not allow you access to. Because, yeah, to some degree, you have to unravel the structures that surround you, the bureaucracies, the authoritarianisms, the draconian systems that you might otherwise be rebelling against. And your rebellion is always curtailed by some pragmatic requirement of the game or your person. A very good example of this is Nicholas O'Brien's work with essay games. One game in particular, The Last Survey, has you play as a surveyor, and it's a single conversation that you have with your boss and the boss of a mining company, and you're trying to tell him that the world has run out of ore, the whatever ore that they might be mining, that it has simply run out. And you dancing around the power hierarchy in that room, the fact that the boss probably already knows this, the fact that your survey is telling him a foundational truth about the company no longer existing, is just remarkably well written. And putting players in those conditions, and those are the exact conditions and negotiations that we find ourselves in more often than not when you try and resist power. You try and make a portion of you isolated and opaque, to surveillance, and then you try and pantomime your acquiescence to some or the other kind of institution to be able to survive. So forcing that dance to re-emerge from within a game where the premise itself is very absurd, I think is very delightful to us, and is one of, I'm sure, many other strategies of eliding outright empathy or empathy tourism.
If I may follow that up with one thing. So, if complicity is the focus, then there is a undermining of agency. I think that is very pivotal here. I believe that's what you are harking back, the undermining of agency. So, if you undermine the player agency in that play space, or the, let's say, whatever the gamescape is, there, don't that or doesn't that lead to a kind of abstraction that might veer away the narrativity of the game? Let's say the player motivation may be undermined. So in that case,
Yeah.
I believe the affect of pain or chaos or confusion, imperfection will come into play.
So, player agency, I've often found, is privileged in power fantasies more than any other kind of narrative, right? And the withdrawal of player agency, I think, is a very, very powerful tool in simulating these these conditions of these behaviors on the part of the player that are not otherwise typical to games. So there are certain things that you just don't do in games, that games tell you you shouldn't be doing anyways because they are boring, and games are more fun because you have greater agency of the world. But by withdrawing that expectation of agency, at least while we are still used to games as they are built today, I think that tends to be quite powerful when you're trying to tell these different kinds of narratives. And yes, in our games, and in trying to build complicity on the part of the player, we withdraw agency to a great degree, massive degree sometimes. Most of our games don't let the players do anything at all except wander.
I would like to add on, just add on to what you just said, because this whole player complicity by withdrawing agency was a very 2010s gritty shooter trope, Spec Ops: The Line, blah blah blah, and that's where, at least for me, a lot of the mainstream conversation about this starts. And it is also interesting because you look at the position where you are put there as compared to the position that you were discussing, where in Spec Ops: The Line, the the idea that your position is somehow a fraught one by the end of it is a significant, you as in the player character's position is more tenuous and fraught by the end of it. That in and of itself is a far less convincing proposition than something you'd find in Edible Bliss. Don't you think so? That just from what I've thought, I've examined about, this player, the withdrawal of agency and complicity, it does seem to me to depend on where the player character is situated in the game world.
And where you are withdrawing the agency from. So Spec Ops: The Line makes a spectacle out of that withdrawal, right? It sort of pivots the entire game around demonstrating psychological harm and physical harm towards a player who is clearly not the not the person at harm in a war space like that. Right?
Yes.
Those are the last people we should be worried about if we were talking about agency to begin with, in these settings. But if you go into the game world not expecting any defined form of agency, out of it, there's no like instrumentalized agency that you are then spectacularly withdrawing. These are just the tools that you're given, and the tools that you're given are very carefully tailored to allow you to do certain things and not allow you to do certain things, but in each case contextualize where the boundaries of your actions lie so that they make some kind of sense in the context of the player. I think, and in those instances, it can be very powerful so that you at least get room within the game to reflect upon what it is that you're changing about it, right? If you are moving across labyrinthian spaces and folding them, your ability to fold, large swathes of urban reality should, at least in our opinion, be punished to some degree. Why? As a character who is otherwise entombed in prison and is confronting incarceration, be allowed to alter not just their reality, but the reality of every player who witnesses the game world without cost, right? So that you understand that folding and unfolding of reality is simultaneously entombed with the player within this confine, and the confine is very much mandated by state. So that form of complicity.
Shovik sir had something to say, sir. Would you mind unmuting yourself and discussing it?
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say hi, Dhruv, and it's lovely to see you and hear you again.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. I had a long response to Shoharda's comment, but that's on the aside. Really, really lovely to see you, and yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely lovely to hear you as well.
Thank you, sir, for pointing that out. I believe I have made a kind of conceptual mistake, I believe. Thanks for pointing that out. Thank you.
I'm also, I mean, thanks, but also to Dhruv as well, because I mean, this is all this conversation regarding fidelity and also empathy towards, I mean, I'm wanting to connect those two in my head in some way. And, Dhruv, I mean, I'm a long time admirer of your work. And I mean, one of the things I was thinking in response to this conversation regarding fidelity is the word fidelity comes from the word fide, right? Faith. So we're being faithful or unfaithful I am not a very faithful person. I've been unfaithful to so many people. But then, of course, there's this kind of association of truth, right? You're
Yeah.
faithful to a truth, right? You're faithful to a truth, and or not faithful to a truth, and which is what kind of Ishan's kind of question. I think Ishan was already kind of expecting your response when he talked about cultural fidelity, and you, of course, talked about how it is really difficult to really even think about cultural fidelity. In that sense, I was thinking of something like empathy. Is it possible to have fidelity towards a sense of empathy? Do I am I going to be and I'm not going to fidelity as Badu talks about it in event
Yeah.
and fidelity, but even so, and there is this one kind of idea of truth. If I say that there is empathy, and the reason why I said this was because if it is there is tourism, and
Yeah.
identity tourism, of course, I take Lisa Nakamura's fascinating, kind of fantastic kind of phrase. I've used it myself. But there is this idea of an identity. Lawrence of Arabia thinks he's an Arab because he has an idea that an Arab is such and such a thing, and
Yeah.
so he can occupy that such and such a thing, right, and be an Arab. Or Kim can be an Indian boy, whatever.
Yeah.
But in this case, of course, with empathy, then we then have to identify empathy as being a particular thing, and not. I mean, that's just the reason why I said that Liz Beth Laponzi's work. I mean, it may be more direct than what you do in your kind of games, but
Yeah.
I think she is trying to do a very different thing here. But also she is more being more activist in her kind of game kind of development, in the sense that she wants to make a game which is going to criticize Trump's oil policies, so she is
Yeah.
making Thunderbird Strike, or she is making another game which is more. But if you look at When Rivers Were Trails, for example, that
Yeah.
is actually much more nuanced, because it is talking about a historical scenario and giving the player. But then the point is, where am I saying that I'm visiting an empathy? I mean, whose empathy and what is empathy? So these are all questions that kind of come up with,
Yeah.
so that's just the reason why I was kind of raising this. And also, I mean, connected to your games as well, because when in Kayamgad, you encounter these people who don't speak,
Yeah.
because they're afraid that if you the whole idea of kind of their speech being subsumed in someone else's speech, or being replaced by someone else's speech. I mean, are we even able to empathize with them? Are we?
Yeah.
Yeah, you see where I'm coming from. We able to reach
True.
that. So that's just the yeah. Anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah, no, that is a wonderful way of putting it. Just how slippery that space is. Also, I think I mean, empathy as empathy that emerges from forming these connections with components of the game world, which map onto, more often than not, the logic of how game worlds are simulated and created, and even understood, is absolutely sort of crucial to being able to understand and belong in those game worlds. Otherwise, game worlds can be very alienating and extraordinarily volatile spaces. So you have to have some patience and perseverance, and eventually a lot of love for the weird conditions that game worlds typically exist in. And the weirder the game world, the more it demands of you to establish those very ephemeral connections within it. And whether those connections map onto some metaphor of reality or not, or derive themselves from some functional form of realism or not, can be a secondary conversation. Sometimes, I suppose, they can be exploitative, but more often than not, you're quite right. It's very hard to draw that line and categorize all forms of this very deep engagement with systems and people and icons and symbols and their arrays as merely a copy of this tiny corner of reality.
Yeah, thanks. That's again another fascinating response, Dhruv, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dhruv. That was a lovely discussion to be a part of. And do we have any other questions? Anyone else? Any opinions?
I
Any
don't think we have any more time. We have to
that
close
is
down
true.
now.
We were it's
Yeah, yeah.
8:38. Where
It was a really like a wonderful discussion. Like the
Thank you. Thank you so
and I
much.
like the thanks to Dhruv for suggesting this whole experimental
absolutely.
format. That was really enlightening for at least to me it was. I can speak for myself at this point,
Okay.
but I hope it was also similarly enlightening to everyone else who decided to join today. We will be putting this up as a recording after the previous one is done, and you will be able to access the whole talk plus discussion on our YouTube channel afterwards, and we'll be also sharing the link to everyone on all of our social media pages. So do expect to see the links there. Thank you, Dhruv. Thank you for coming here for this wonderful, fascinating talk, followed by this really engrossing talk.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's really nice to be able to return to a space, that was also in many ways sort of foundational for us.
It's wonderful to have you back here.
Yeah.
And we're very grateful you could make the time. And thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Dhruv. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. And we'll have the recording up soon. I think today we shall log off.
Meet you all soon.
So see you all
Bye.
soon. We hope to have Dhruv back
Thank you.
sometime soon. Bye everyone.